I'm standing in the heart of old downtown Toronto, which is near the site of an old unsolved murder. The year was 1858, and the day was March 17th, St. Patrick's Day. And on that day, several thousand Irish Catholics were gathered in this area to celebrate their saint. This is a strange place for Catholics to be because this is the heart of Protestant Toronto of the 1850s. The scene went down a bit like this. Many people were gathered here to hear a speech given by the most famous Catholic of the Irish Catholic of the time, a man by the name of Darcy McGee, a future father of Confederation, who was going to be speaking in front of St. Lawrence Hall, right over there. And the crowd was gathered here and forming up on the streets, and someone came up down that alleyway. It was an orange carter coming up from the St. Lawrence Market just to the south of us here. And as he neared the crowd, he whipped his horses and drove them into the crowds. The crowd drove him back with mud and stones and other detritus from the streets. And a fight broke out, and it went down that alleyway, down towards Colburn Street. Now, standing pretty close to where I am right now is a man by the name of Matthew Sheedy and his wife. Someone came up to him and told him that his brother-in-law was down that alleyway, caught in a fight. Matthew left his wife and headed off to rescue his brother-in-law. About 15 to 20 minutes later, he walks into a nearby pharmacy and he says he's been stabbed and he's asking for a bandage. He was rushed to the hospital where he died the next day. Now, what happened in the hours in between, the minutes in between, is unknown and almost completely unknowable. There was an inquest held into his death. In the course of events, kind of went something like this. The fight moved down that alleyway and ended up in the courtyard of a place, a tavern owned by a man by the name of William Lennox, who was both an Orangeman and a member of the city council. Lennox himself got personally involved in the fight. According to the testimony of one person, he swore he would not rest that night until he'd waded knee deep in Catholic blood. He also had a gun which he carried on since he was assaulted on the previous Orange Day, July 12th, by Catholics. So he produced his gun and he started waving it around. He was disarmed by the chief of police. Now, several witnesses in that fight said they saw Matthew Sheedy there. But, the Catholics testified that he was trying to break up the fight, and the Orangemen testified that he was trying to encourage the fight further and drive it crazy. His wounds the source of his wounds were unknown. He was stabbed, but the question of what he was stabbed by was never really determined. Now, according to Catholic observers, he was stabbed by a pitchfork, which would have meant he would have been stabbed by one of Lennox's stable hands, instead of the only people with pitchforks and known to have pitchforks in that fight at that time. According to all the Protestants, he was stabbed by a switchblade, which meant he would have been stabbed by one of his friends. Furthermore, while he was at the pharmacist getting band-aids, several people came and talked to him and asked him what he was doing. Now, the Catholics who all spoke to him said he was stabbed by someone who fit the description of one of Lennox's stable hands. The Protestants all said he refused to mention who had stabbed him because it was a friend and he didn't want his friend to get into trouble. Ultimately, the inquest jury, which was composed entirely of Protestants, found him stabbed by a person or persons unknown. The riot that ended in Matthew Sheedy's death had a second act, and that was down to Lennox, the owner of the tavern and the councilman. He had been struck in the fight in his courtyard, and over the course of the remainder of the day, several dozen, if not hundreds, of Orangemen came down to check on their orange friend and see if he was all right. And so the crowd grew and grew in Lennox's tavern that evening, getting angrier and angrier as the liquor flowed. And then word came that the Catholics were actually at a hotel just across the street called the National Hotel and having their St. Patrick's Day feast. And so around 8 or 9 o'clock that night, the crowd burst out of Lennox's tavern and attacked the hotel. The attack lasted for about 3 hours. The windows of the hotel were smashed. Bricks were thrown through the window. Darcy McGee, who's a guest at the dinner, was chased away in his carriage, and he barely escaped with his life. There was another trial into that event, and once again, testimony was broken down Catholic and Protestant lines. The chief of police, who was present at the riot with police forces trying to keep the two parties apart, spent about an hour to 2 hours standing in front of the front door of the National Hotel staring out at the group of Protestants, and yet he testified that he could not recognize a single one of them or identify any of them at all. In the exact same testimony, though, he also testified that he poked his head into the National Hotel when he heard a noise inside, and he saw and identified several Catholics, just after looking at them for a few seconds. The only people who would eventually be charged for the attack on the hotel were the Catholics on the inside, one of whom fired his gun back in self-defense when the Protestants started firing their guns at the hotel. These two incidents led the Irish Catholics of Toronto to believe that they could not be protected or defended by the city. It was a massive boost to their recruitment efforts for the Fenians and the Green parties to try and come up with their own self-defense. And years later, these events were still called upon. In 1863, the publisher of a Catholic newspaper would write about, in his conclusion, about another riot. This one, the Corpus Christi riot up by St. Michael's Cathedral, where a group of Protestants surrounded and attacked a group of Catholics trying to have a procession around St. Michael's Cathedral. And he would testify that the Protestants don't want us to have even processions on our own grounds. Now we must take our orders from when we can have our rites and our celebrations from the murderers of Sheedy and the sackers of the National Hotel.